Hey everyone, Temporal here, and we are past due for a meta update. I did want to wait for the World Cup to happen to see if there were any surprises, anything that caught me off guard. Fortunately, there wasn't really much, with the exception of Protect the Zarya or Winston Goats, however you want to think about it, composition. So with that, this is my meta map. This is kind of what the meta looks like right now. There is, of course, a little more variation possible than what you see here. For example, in my goats variants, I haven't covered every single way that you can change May goats with the flex support or hog goats with the flex support, or the way that you can, when adjusting a goats comp, swap out generally your Briggs or your Zarya or your Diva. All that stuff does give you more variation. We didn't cover all of that here, but that's okay. This is a general look at what the meta looks like, what the satellite compositions look like, and kind of everything that makes sense in it. Same thing down here with bunkers. Bunkers are mostly periphery to the meta. There are other types of bunkers. They don't have to be these exact 6 heroes. But anyway, I don't really want to get into that. I want to zoom in and look at kind of the meta at its most basic level. So everyone, or many of us, probably know that the meta exists in a bit of a counter triangle right now, or a rock, paper, scissors setup, where Goats beats up on Protect the McCree beats up on Sombra Doomfist Dive, and Sombra Doomfist Dive beats up on Goats. That's pretty simple. Everyone can just win a fight. Once they win that fight, great. The opponents are going to come back having made their swaps, beat them up with the thing that counters them, and everyone's hunky dory. We're just playing rock, paper, scissors, and whoever wins the most fights they're not supposed to goes ahead and wins. It's not quite that simple. There's actually a bit more to it, but in principle, that would work. Reality of the matter, though, is if we zoom out, there's other things to consider. First off, it really sucks to play defense if these are the only 3 compositions you can play, because Goats loses pretty darn hard to Sombra Doomfist Dive, and Sombra Doomfist Dive loses pretty hard to Protect the McCree. So if you're coming out and you have to play King's Row defense and you don't have specific knowledge of what your opponent wants to play, you haven't played them a bunch before, or you're walking out blind on King of the Hill, you want to be able to open with a comp that's a little more versatile. And that's what our second ring is for. These are the more well-rounded, slightly more generalist compositions that see play. And when you look at the tier 2 scene, as we saw in the Beat Invitational, you see a lot more of these. So Cyber Dive, or Sombra Goats, or Protect the McCree with a Reinhardt. And these will still win against what they're supposed to beat. For example, if you're playing Sombra Goats, you can still win against Protect the McCree, but you're not going to lose as hard to Sombra Doomfist Dive, and that's why I'm using dotted lines here. So I don't want to really associate percentages with these, but if you were to think about it as Goats will beat up on Protect the McCree 80% of the time. It's going to win that matchup 80% of the time. Sombra Goats might beat up on Protected McCree only 60% of the time. We could have dotted lines there. Again, those percentages aren't real. They're just something that I might use representative to give you the idea. And when you're playing defense, you want to have something that they can't just walk out with something that hard counters you the same way. That's going to be in your favor. So if we're playing this kind of second ring here, those are nice generalist comps. They give us what we want in terms of, okay, our skill can shine through a little bit more. If we're playing Sombra Goats and you walk out on Sombra Doomfist Dive, our Sombra can hack your Doomfist. We can try to focus him down. If we do, great, we win. If you keep him alive, and you do have the tools to do so, you still win. But at least we had a chance. Similarly, if we're running our Sombra Goats and we try to run over a Protect the McCree comp, once we get to you and we get into that brawl, and we will get there, you're not going to stop us because we have enough point pressure and we have that Rhine shield. We're going to be able to force that brawl. We're going to mostly run you over if you're Protect the McCree like that. But because we have that Sombra, we don't have quite as much brawling power. Our Sombra doesn't do all that much work against your McCree Briggs composition, so she's lost a little value. So we're not as strong against you as if we were a Goats comp. And all of these comps on this second ring kind of work the same way, where they still beat the comps that they're supposed to beat. They still have a favorable matchup, but they don't lose as hard to the comps that are expected to beat them. And that'll get you pretty far. If you're just in the scrim scene, you're some 4K plus team, and you're playing these 6 comps, that can work pretty well. You can defend or play King of the Hill with this second ring, and you can go ahead and attack once you've identified, or you can, once you've lost a team fight, come back with the comp that wins harder on this inner ring here. Great, go ahead and do that. But things do get a bit beyond that. When we zoom out further, we have kind of our satellite compositions, and now we get into our full families. So we have our goats family up top, we have our dive family over here to the left, and we have our protect the McCree family over here to the right. And as a general rule, these families follow the same pattern, but things get a bit more complex. We, of course, have our map-specific picks that we're going to pull out, like on Control Center. We might go, hey, this is such a goats map that we're not worried about you playing dive, so we're going to pull out May Goats, a goats comp that is specifically there for beating up on other goats comps. Or we might go, hey, it's Gibraltar, you can't run goats on Gibraltar, so we're going to run a Widow Dive comp, or we're going to run a Protect the Widow comp, something like that. Great. But what really gets cool is what we actually saw quite a bit of in the World Cup is once teams have decided that, hey, we've spent more of our scrim time on goats, or we've spent more of our scrim time on dive because either our team had a natural tendency that made them better at dive, or our team had a natural tendency that made them better at this protect the McCree side, or maybe they just feel that goats is best and goats is really the strongest of these three, so they wanted to put most of their time into goats. As those things happen, we run into a nice little situation where we get to start taking advantage of triangle breakers, as I like to call them. And an example of this could be dive comps, so Sombra Doomfist dive, Cyber dive. Mostly the whole family of dive comps here, in general, loses to protect the McCree comps. It's really hard to dive those comps that have the double stun there. But dive does have access to a few comps that can pick on protect the McCree. If dive starts pulling out double sniper or pharmacy widow dive, it's really got the tools to outpoke Protect the McCree. And Protect the McCree needs to win poke battles. It needs to do that. If it can't win its poke battle, it's in a poor spot. So the dive side of the triangle can beat their counter by running one of these super ranged comps. Great, that's fantastic. If you run one of these super ranged comps, Protect the McCree can't beat you anymore, and they're going to have to do something. Well, if you run one of these double ranged comps, what range has always been vulnerable to. If you run 2 range DPS, if you run a lot of poke like that, you've always been vulnerable to getting dove yourself because your peel falls off when you're running 2 range DPS like that. So the correct answer to one of these triangle breakers on the dive side would be, okay, the Protect the McCree guys can come over. They can play some sort of dive comp. They could play this Cyber dive over here, for example, because as we can see, Cyber dive is pretty strong against normal dive comps in general. Great. And they can beat up on your double sniper or your pharmacy widow dive. Whatever, they're going to beat up on your triangle breaker. Well, if you're a dive specialist team, not to say you can only play dive comps, but dive comps is what you feel is the strongest side of the triangle, where you've spent more of your scrim time than the other two sides of the triangle. You're probably okay with that. You want the dive mirror, so you can swap into your own more normal dive comp, and you're happy to take the dive mirror match and go ahead and try to win from there, right? That's going to work out great from there. Okay, cool. So now either they stay in this dive mirror matchup or they go back to playing kind of this rock, paper, scissors game where they go back to a more normal Protect the McCree, you jump over to another triangle breaker, and that works out well there. So you can both do that, and that can cause you guys to kind of trade team fights, and who wins is going to be based on who wins the most team fights that they weren't favored to win, based on just the triangle of counters here, and based on how efficiently you guys are saving your ultimate charge as you move between comps. So for example, as we look here, if we're moving from Cyber Dive over to this version of Double Sniper. Well, this version of Double Sniper requires 4 swaps. That's not super efficient for dive. Same thing over here. We're looking at 3 swaps. That's not super efficient for dive. On the other hand, if the Protect the McCree comp is going, hey, we're a normal Protect the McCree comp, and then maybe we just make 2 swaps to go to a version of Cyber Dive that uses Zenyatta. Maybe that's more efficient, and you get to balance more ults like that, etc. Anyway, What we're looking at here is this dive team has now done something interesting where they've forced the Protect the McCree team to come play mirror with them. They get to play mirror, and then the Protect the McCree team has to make the decision: do we stay dive and take this mirror that we haven't put as much scrim time into, or do we rotate back and then keep rotating back and forth like that? And that's fine. Either of those can be right options. Obviously, that's taking advantage of triangle breakers. You don't always have to take advantage of triangle breakers. If this dive team is not so specialized in dive, you just see a more normal version, which would be, okay, you're playing Protect the McCree, we're playing dive, cool. We're going to come back from spawn as goats and beat up on you like that. And then you move over to dive, so we move over to Protect the McCree. And then um, we beat you up as Protect the McCree, so you come back as goats, beat us up, we move around again. So either of those are possible, but if you've spent a lot of time specializing in one side of the triangle, access to triangle breakers are something that really strengthen your ability, really kind of give you something that you want there. If you're a more balanced team who's doing everything, going around the triangle is fine. But you'll notice going around the triangle requires learning lots of different compositions. So there's definitely some appeal to specializing a bit more. If we move up to goats, we actually see goats has their own triangle breaker. We saw a lot of this out of Team UK. So they can be running a normal goats comp down here, but then when dive inevitably comes out against them, they move over to hog sombra goats, and that does a great job. You've got the tools to shut down a doomfist. You can handle another sombra. Genji's no big deal. Pharmacies aren't that big a deal. When they go in for their barrage, they're the easiest hook in the world. They can be hooked at other times when they're trying to do things. They can be hacked. We saw lots of success from hog sombra goats against a variety of dive comps. So those are good. Those are another triangle breaker like that. But as seems to be the pattern with triangle breakers, it loses pretty hard against a more normal goats comp. So if the dive team goes, okay, we're going to answer by moving over to goats ourselves, that's going to mostly run over hog sombra goats. If you're specialized as a goats team, it's probably pretty okay with you to get another team to play goats, though, because it's just one swap in many situations to get from hog sombra goats to sombra goats. And then maybe you win a team fight with that, and as the moment allows, as the flow of battle allows, you go ahead and make another swap and get yourself over to Zen goats, which is probably what you really want to be playing in that mirror match there. Great. And then they have a decision to make of, do they stay in this goats mirror match, or do they go back, resetting some of their ult charge there. Cool. So same option that Dive had over here, but you'll notice that Dive's meta breaker comps are really map specific. You can't just run Pharmacy Widow Dive or Double Sniper on any map. There do have to be certain conditions, long enough sight lines to really give the snipers advantage over a McCree, for example. That's what you're punishing. You're punishing the fact that McCree's range is not the same as snipers there, or sightlines that the Pharah can play with in terms of cover in the sky, etc. This Hog Sombra Goats isn't nearly so limited. So that could be a pretty good argument that, hey, maybe Goats is the strongest piece of the meta triangle right now. An argument against that might be that, you know what, Cyberdive is a nice generalist comp, and Cyberdive is also really strong against most normal dive comps. Cyberdive beats up on Sniper Dive comps. Cyberdive beats up pretty well on most of these. So having a generalist comp that is also pretty good against your family could be a nice argument for dive. I don't really need to get into which side is the strongest right now because I'm not convinced that there is a strongest side at this moment. Protect the McCree. So Protect the McCree is the side that no one has championed, I'd argue. North America has traditionally been championing the dive side of this triangle. Europe has been championing the goat side of this triangle. And Protect the McCree has definitely existed, but most Protect the McCree play has come in the form of European teams rotating over to Protect the McCree or to this side of the triangle to force a response from dive teams. Now, though, we've seen something interesting. I'm calling it Protect the Zarya. This may seem controversial that I'm putting this in the Protect the McCree side of the triangle. The truth is the composition is one swap away from a normal Zen Goats comp and one swap away from a normal Protect the McCree comp. If the Winston goes to Reinhardt, that's a normal Goats comp. If the Zarya goes to McCree, that's a normal Protect the McCree comp. So you could see why it would belong anywhere. Because of how the comp functions and what it's strong and weak against, I actually think it fits better over here as an example of a triangle breaker than it does in goats as an example of doing well against other goats comps, a strong against its own family type pick there. And the reason for that is because what it loses to. So you'll notice that the triangle breaker comps from dive over here lose to dive, even though they beat what dive is traditionally weak to and protect the McCree. And the triangle breaker up here for goats that we went over loses to goats, even though it's strong against what goats is usually weak to in dive. This protect the Zarya comp works the same way. It did a very nice job of beating up on Zen Goats comps, specifically against UK, as we saw very recently, but it does not have the poke to keep up with a Protect the McCree comp. If a Protect the McCree comp is drove well and just uses its tanks to contest the point and is constantly taking advantage of that poke battle, it does not have the ability to last out during that poke battle, and it's not really going to be able to execute a hard dive on them as its dive needs to come from very close range, and it's just not going to be able to get that done against a team that's kiting it well. So now we have all three sides of the triangle with some nice tools. In terms of my advice for what I would recommend people play, it's really up to you guys, but you do want to keep in mind that the tier 1 teams or the teams that we saw at the World Cup, while they're playing the main comps, the generalist type comps, and a bunch of these satellite comps, including making really good use of the triangle breakers, most teams don't get to scrim as much as they do. So if you're running a tier 3 team, you're playing on a tier 3 team, you're probably going to get more benefit from either playing in this second tier here and working mostly with these more generalist comps, maybe get good at two of these generalist comps and go, okay, we'll play these two sides of the triangle, or we'll play these two sides of the triangle, and we'll trust that we win the mirror, as well as a couple map specific comps. Like, okay, yes, we need to be able to play some sort of Widow comp on Gibraltar, or maybe we do want a May Goats comp for Control Center, etc. So that's what I generally recommend. It's okay to play the full triangle, but that requires a lot of time to really get it. And it's also okay to go, no, we are hard, a very hard dive team, or we are a very hard goats team. But in that case, you're really going to have to be able to make good use of these triangle breakers here. And those are imperfect. The dive ones, for example, aren't going to work on every map. So anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today. I shared this map, this meta map as I'm calling it, with a few of my students, and they all really liked it. So I thought I'd share it out with everyone. If you guys have questions, comments, want to know how something works, feel free to let me know, and I'll go live in Twitch in a couple seconds to answer. Or if you're seeing this on YouTube, put it in the comments, and I'll be happy to respond. Thanks, guys. Temporal out.